When you announce a change, most people don't hear opportunity, they hear threat. Their pulse quickens, their working memory narrows, and that brilliant strategic thinker you hired becomes defensive and political. It's not because they're difficult, it's because their brain is protecting them. Here's what leaders miss. You were brought in to speed up growth, which means constant change, new priorities, different processes, reorganised teams, perhaps letting people go. Every change you introduce triggers the brain's threat detection system in ways that can either accelerate your turnaround or doom it. The science is clear. When people perceive social threat, their amygdala activates just as it would in response to physical danger. Cortisol floods their system, prefrontal cortex function decreases, and defensive behaviour kicks in. They resist not because your strategy is wrong, but because their neurobiology is protecting them from what feels like danger. But neuroscience is only part of the story. Change also triggers a deeper psychological journey that most leaders misunderstand. You cannot jump from ending one way of working straight to beginning another. People must travel through what feels like a wilderness first, an uncomfortable neutral zone where the old is gone but the new isn't yet real. Push this and resistance will intensify. And beneath all of this sits organisational culture. These unspoken assumptions about how things work that determine whether people feel safe enough to navigate change honestly or whether they go underground with their concerns. A quick note on format. What you're hearing is a synthesis of experts' published research and frameworks. We've worked to represent their ideas accurately whilst translating them to your specific context. That is, a CEO trying to build the organisational capabilities that enable growth. In this briefing, we're examining change management through three complementary lenses. We'll hear from David Rock, who created the SCARF model that maps the 5 social domains that trigger threat or reward responses. William Bridges will help us understand why change creates a psychological transition that cannot be skipped or rushed. And Edgar Sheen will show us why culture, particularly the ability to ask rather than tell, determines whether change will actually stick. This matters intensely for growth-focused CEOs. The board is watching, and you need to move quickly. But speed without understanding how people actually navigate change creates exactly the dysfunction that delays your turnaround. Let's understand how to lead change in ways that move people forward rather than away from it. Here's David Rock's perspectives. Rock's research into social neuroscience reveals something leaders frequently underestimate. The human brain responds to social threat with the same neural circuitry as physical threats. When someone perceives their status might decrease, their certainty feels threatened, or they lose autonomy, their brain responds as if facing genuine danger. This has profound implications for how we lead change. The SCARF model Rock developed synthesizes research across multiple neuroscience domains into 5 social experiences that reliably activate either threat or reward response: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Rock emphasizes 2 critical principles. First, that minimizing threat is more powerful than maximizing reward. The brain's threat response is faster, stronger, and more enduring than the reward response. Second, once a threat is activated, cognitive capacity diminishes. People literally cannot think clearly, solve problems as effectively, or collaborate as well as when their threat system is engaged. Consider status, which Rock defines as relative importance to others. When you announce that a team's work is being deprioritized or reorganized, people often perceive it as a status loss. Their brain perceives this as threat even if the logic makes sense. Rock's research shows that this threat response impairs the prefrontal cortex, reducing working memory, problem-solving capability by as much as 30%. People become defensive not because they're opposed to your strategy, but because their brain is literally protecting them from the perceived diminishment. Certainty involves our ability to predict the future. Rock's work demonstrates that the brain craves patterns and predictability. When you introduce change without clear timelines, transparent decision criteria, or explicit expectation, you're not just creating ambiguity, you are triggering sustained threat response. According to Rock's research, uncertainty generates cortisol release that persists as long as the ambiguity remains. So for CEOs who must move quickly, this creates a particular challenge. You often don't have all the answers when you begin a diagnosis. Rock's framework suggests that acknowledging uncertainty explicitly, whilst providing whatever structure you can creates less stress than avoiding the topic entirely. Autonomy in Rock's model represents people's sense of control over their environment and decisions. His research indicates that even small losses of autonomy can trigger disproportionate threat response. When change introduces new approval processes, removes decision-making authority, or increases micromanagement, people experience it as a threat, even if the changes have a rationale justification. Rock argues that wherever possible, provide choice within boundaries. Give people control of how they achieve outcomes, even when you must control what outcomes are required. Relatedness captures our sense of safety with others and our feeling of belonging to a group. Rock's neuroscience research shows that social connection and trust generate oxytocin release, which actively suppresses the amygdala's threat response. This is particularly relevant during organisational change when teams are disrupted, reporting structures shift, or some people depart. That loss of established relationships triggers threat response. Rock emphasises that leaders must consciously rebuild relatedness through transparency, consistent communication, and explicit attention to how new structures will operate. Fairness concerns our perception of just and equitable treatment. Rock's research reveals that perceived unfairness activates the same neural regions as physical pain. When people believe decisions lack transparency, or see inconsistent treatment of similar situations, or witness different rules for different groups, that threat response persists. For CEOs managing turnarounds where difficult decisions are inevitable, Rock's framework suggests that transparent decision-making processes and clear rationale matter as much as the decisions themselves. Rock makes a critical point that many leaders miss. You cannot completely eliminate threats during change. Change, by definition, creates uncertainty and status shift. The goal isn't to pretend that the threat doesn't exist. It's to minimise unnecessary threat whilst being honest about what's genuinely uncertain, and to actively create reward response where possible. According to Rock's model, small rewards can significantly counterbalance moderate threat. Public recognition, increased scope, opportunity to demonstrate expertise, these aren't trivial. They generate dopamine release and activate the brain's reward circuitry, which can help people navigate necessary threats more effectively. Rock's research also addresses language. How you frame change matters neurologically, not just politically. Saying everything was broken before maximises status threat. Saying here's what worked and will protect whilst fixing what hasn't minimises it. Claiming if you can't adapt you won't survive maximises certainty threat. Explaining that there's process and timeline for how we'll decide will minimise it. This isn't soft language. It's about understanding that your choice of words either triggers defense neurobiology or enables people to engage their prefrontal cortex in problem solving. One final insight from Rock's work. The threat response is not weakness. It's ancient survival circuitry that kept humans alive. During change, leaders who understand they're working with neurobiology and not character flaws approach resistance with more effective intervention. The defensive political behaviour you're seeing isn't necessarily opposition to your strategy. It's quite probably a threat response that could have been managed differently. What we love about Rock's framework is that it gives us neural clarity on why change feels dangerous to people, even when logically it makes sense. Status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. 5 domains where poor change management creates sustained threat response. For you, this matters because you are operating under time pressure. The board wants visible momentum, but if your change approach inadvertently triggers widespread threat response, you will face the resistance, politics, and talent loss that delay that turnaround. Rock's work suggests that conscious attention to minimising threat and creating reward isn't soft leadership. Neural efficiency determines execution speed. Here's a synthesis of William Bridges' perspectives. Bridges' fundamental insight, developed over 3 decades of consulting work, is that leaders confuse change with transition, and this confusion dooms most change efforts. According to Bridges, change is the external event, the new strategy, the reorganisation, the system implementation. Change can happen quickly. You announce it, and it's done. Transition, however, is the internal psychological process that people must go through to come to terms with that change. Transition happens slowly, and it cannot be rushed without creating the resistance that you are trying to avoid. Bridges identifies 3 distinct phases of transition that every person must navigate during change. The first phase, which he calls ending, is paradoxical. Before you can begin something new, you must end what used to be. This ending phase involves genuine loss. People are losing familiar routines, established relationships, or comfortable ways of working, and often a sense of identity connected to that old way. Bridges emphasises that these losses are real, even when the change is objectively positive for the organisation. A person whose team is being reorganised experiences loss even if the new structure is strategically superior. According to Bridges' model, the ending phase triggers emotions that many CEOs find uncomfortable: anger, denial, confusion, frustration, or anxiety. His research shows that attempting to suppress or ignore these emotions doesn't eliminate them. It drives them underground, where they manifest as passive resistance, political behaviour, or quiet exodus. Bridge argues that leaders must acknowledge losses explicitly and create space for people to grieve what is ending. This isn't therapeutic indulgence, it's a practical necessity. People cannot physiologically move forward until they've processed what they are leaving behind. Bridges provides specific guidance for managing these endings. First, identify who is losing what. Not everyone loses the same things, and not all losses are tangible. Some people lose status, others lose certainty. Some lose comfortable relationships or ways of working that they had mastered. Second, don't be surprised by overreaction. Bridges observes that the people's emotional responses during endings can seem disproportionate to the actual change. This happens because the current change triggers an accumulated grief from previous changes that were perhaps never properly processed. For you, this means understanding that resistance to your organisation might actually be pent-up frustration from 3 previous reorganisations that were poorly managed. Third, communicate clearly what is ending and what isn't. Bridge emphasises that ambiguity about scope amplifies anxiety. When you say we're reorganising, people assume that everything is changing. Explicitly stating what's staying the same reduces unnecessary threat. Fourth, treat the past with respect. Bridges argues that dismissing previous approaches as failures invalidates people's past contributions and triggers status threat. Frame change as evolution. The second transition phase, which Bridges calls the neutral zone, is perhaps his most important contribution to change management thinking. This is the psychological wilderness between ending the old and fully embracing the new. According to Bridges, the neutral zone is where the old way is gone, but the new way isn't yet fully operational. It's characterised by confusion, uncertainty, impatience, and often anxiety. Productivity typically drops during this phase, motivation can be low, and people feel disoriented. Bridges makes a crucial observation that many leaders miss. You cannot skip the neutral zone. Attempting to jump directly from ending to the new beginning results in superficial compliance rather than genuine transition. People go through the motions of the new way, whilst internally still operating according to old assumptions. Bridges argues that the neutral zone, whilst uncomfortable, is actually where the most important psychological work happens. It's the period of reorientation and redefinition. It's where new patterns form and old habits genuinely let go. For leaders under pressure to show quick results, Bridges' framework presents a challenge. The neutral zone can't be rushed, but it can be managed effectively. His guidance includes several specific tactics. First, normalise that neutral zone. Tell people explicitly that confusion and uncertainty are normal parts of transition, not signs that something is wrong. Second, use the neutral zone creatively. Because normal routines are disrupted, this is actually the best time for innovation and experimentation. People are more open to new ideas when old patterns are broken. Bridges suggests creating temporary structures, pilot projects, task forces, and experimental approaches that allow people to try new ways of working without full commitment. Third, provide extra support and communication during this neutral zone. Bridges observes that leaders often communicate heavily at the beginning of change, then go quiet, which is exactly when people need the most reassurance. Fourth, set short-term goals that provide quick wins. Bridges argues that motivation during the neutral zone depends on seeing progress. small, achievable milestones that help people feel that they're moving forward even when the overall change isn't complete. Fifth, strengthen the sense of community. According to Bridges, that neutral zone is isolating. People don't know if other people are struggling too. Creating forums for people to share experience reduces isolation and builds collective resilience. And the final phase, new beginnings, represent genuine psychological adoption of the new way. Bridges emphasises that new beginnings cannot be mandated, they emerge. A true new beginning is characterised by renewed energy, fresh commitment, and people acting in accordance with new assumptions rather than just following new rules. According to Bridges' model, people reach new beginnings at different paces. Some will arrive quickly, others will take substantially longer. Attempting to force a uniform pace creates the appearance of adoption without the reality. Bridges identifies several conditions that facilitate new beginnings. First, clarity about purpose and benefit. People need to understand not just what they're supposed to do differently, but why the new way matters and how it connects to the organisational success. Second, visible leadership commitment. Bridges argues that people watch what leaders do more than what leaders say. If leaders don't genuinely operate according to the new way, people won't either. Third, quick wins that demonstrate the new approach works. Fourth, celebration and recognition of people who embrace the new way. Bridges observes that public acknowledgement of the new behaviours reinforces adoption across an organisation. One final insight from Bridges' work: the most effective change leaders are those who understand that managing transition is fundamentally about managing the emotional and psychological journey, not just the logistical implementation. For CEOs leading change, this means recognising that resistance isn't primarily about disagreement with strategy. It's about people being asked to let go of familiar ways of working, navigate an uncomfortable neutral zone, and adopt new patterns before they can clearly see that those patterns will work. We like this because Bridges gives us a psychological rope that Rock's neuroscience predicts but doesn't fully explain. When a change triggers a threat response, people enter an ending phase where they must process loss. Then they navigate a neutral zone where anxiety peaks and productivity drops. Only then can genuine new beginnings emerge. For you, Bridges' model explains why rushing change backfires. You cannot skip the neutral zone. When you try, you get compliance without genuine transition. People follow new processes whilst continuing to operate internally according to those old assumptions. Your timeline must account for the psychological journey, not just the logistical implementation. The question isn't whether people will go through endings and neutral zones. The question is whether you manage those phases consciously or let them happen chaotically. Here's a synthesis of Edgar Schein's perspective. Schein's decades of work on organisational culture reveal why change efforts that look good on paper often fail in practice. They don't address the deep, often unconscious assumptions that determine how people actually behave. According to Schein, organisational culture operates at 3 levels. The surface level consists of visible artefacts, the structures, processes and behaviours that you can observe. The middle level compromises espoused values, the stated beliefs and principles people claim to hold. And the deepest level contains basic underlying assumptions, the unconscious, the taken for granted beliefs that actually drive behaviour. Schein argues that most change efforts focus on artefacts, changing organisation charts, implementing new systems, and announcing new values. But unless change reaches the level of assumptions, it won't truly stick. People might follow new processes whilst unconsciously undermining them through behaviours driven by unchanged assumptions. For you, this perhaps explains why previous change efforts failed despite looking reasonable on paper. The changes never penetrated to that assumption level. Schein's framework suggests several implications for leading change during turnaround. First, understand what assumptions currently drive behaviour. These assumptions are often invisible to people operating within the culture. Schein developed a process called culture decoding, where leaders systematically surface and examine taken for granted beliefs. Common assumptions that resist change include: conflict is dangerous and should be avoided. Admitting problems reflects poorly on you. Speed matters more than thoroughness, or what worked before will work again. Second, recognise that assumptions exist at every level of the organisation. creating subculture. According to Sheen's research, executives, middle managers, and frontline workers often hold fundamentally different assumptions about how the organisation works. Executives might assume that people will tell us when there are problems, whilst frontline workers assume that bad news isn't welcome. These conflicting assumptions create the coordination failures and information gap that plague turnarounds. Third, understanding that changing deep assumption requires sustained effort and cannot happen through a single announcement alone. Sheen identifies several mechanisms that leaders can use to shift culture. What leaders pay attention to, measure, and control signals what actually matters. Where leaders allocate resources demonstrates real priorities despite stated values. How leaders respond to critical incidents and crises reveals underlying assumption. Whom leaders hire, promote, and dismiss shows what behaviours are truly valued. Sheen's concept of humble inquiry, developed in his later work, is particularly relevant to change management. According to Sheen, Western culture emphasises leaders as experts who tell rather than ask. Yet, during change, this expertise-focused approach creates exactly the dynamics that prevent honest communication. Sheen defines humble inquiry as the fine art of drawing someone out, of asking questions to which you do not already know the answer, of building a relationship based on curiosity and interest in the other person. For change management, humble inquiry addresses a fundamental problem. Leaders initiating change often don't understand how current work actually gets done or what obstacles people face. Sheen argues that leaders must temporarily set aside their status as experts and genuinely inquire into the other's experiences. This inquiry serves multiple purposes. It surfaces information that leaders need to design effective change. It builds the trust necessary for people to be honest about the implementation of challenges. It models vulnerability, enabling others to admit uncertainty rather than fake understanding. She identifies specific types of questions that enable humble inquiry during change. What's going on opens up a conversation without presupposing answers. What troubles you invites people to share concerns honestly, and how can I help positions the leader as a support rather than judge. According to the framework, the quality of these questions matters less than the genuine curiosity and lack of preformed solutions behind them. Humble inquiry also addresses Sheen's observation that upward communication in organisations is profoundly faulty. Subordinates know things that would make change work better, but they withhold this information for various reasons: fear of looking incompetent, concern about being blamed for problems, uncertainty about whether speaking up will make a difference, desire to protect their leader from bad news. During change, when stakes are high and anxiety peaks, upward communication becomes even more distorted unless leaders actively create safety through inquiry. Sheen developed the concept of psychological safety decades before it became popularised, arguing in 1965 that people need to feel safe enough to learn new behaviours without fearing punishment for mistakes. According to Sheen's framework, psychological safety during change emerges not from reassuring people everything will be fine, but from leaders demonstrating through action that honesty is valued more than false optimism. When leaders respond to bad news with curiosity rather than blame, psychological safety builds. When leaders admit their own uncertainty rather than pretending to have all the answers, others feel permission to be equally honest. Sheen also emphasises the role of culture in enabling or blocking collaboration across functional boundaries. During reorganisations and turnarounds, cross-functional coordination becomes critical. Yet, according to Sheen's research, different functions often develop distinct subcultures with incompatible assumptions. Engineering might assume that quality comes from careful analysis, whilst sales assumes that speed wins deals. These conflicting assumptions create friction that persists even after reorganisation because the structure changed, but the assumptions didn't. Sheen argues that leaders must explicitly address these subculture conflicts rather than assuming new organisational charts will resolve them. This requires bringing people in from different functions together to surface and discuss their divergent assumptions, and then consciously build shared assumptions that enable collaboration. Sheen calls this process cultural island building, creating pockets where new assumptions can develop and demonstrate their value before attempting organisation-wide change. One practical implication of Sheen's work for you: culture change can begin at the surface and work down. You can change artefacts, introduce new meeting structures, create new roles, implement new systems, and if you're patient, these changes can eventually shift espoused values and underlying assumptions. But Sheen emphasises patient. Surface changes rarely impact deep assumptions quickly. You will need sustained consistency between what you say, what you do, and what you reward for assumptions to genuinely shift. Sheen's final contribution to understanding change management concerns leadership itself. According to his later work with his son, Peter Shine, effective change leadership requires what he calls humble leadership, a shift from transactional, role-based relationships to personalised, trust-based relationships. During change, people need to feel that leaders genuinely care about their well-being, not just their performance. They need to see leaders facing uncertainty too, not just distant authorities with all the answers. Sheen argues that this foundation enables open communication and experimentation, which successful change requires. These three frameworks converge on a critical insight. Resistance to change isn't primarily about opposition to your strategy. It's about threat response, psychological transition, and cultural assumptions that operate below conscious awareness. Rock's scarf model gives you the neural domains to monitor: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Any change that threatens these triggers is a defensive response. Your diagnostic questions during turnaround: where am I inadvertently creating status stress? Where am I leaving people uncertain? When could I provide clarity? Where am I removing autonomy unnecessarily? Where are established relationships being disrupted without attention to rebuilding them? Where might people perceive unfairness in how decisions are made? Bridges' transition model reminds you that change is external, but transition is internal. You cannot mandate new beginnings. People must first process endings, the genuine losses that they're experiencing, even if the change is strategically sound. Then they must navigate the neutral zone, that uncomfortable wilderness where old ways are gone, but the new ways aren't yet fully operational. Your timeline must account for this psychological journey. The question isn't whether people will experience endings in neutral zones, it's whether you manage those phases consciously or let them happen chaotically whilst wondering why resistance persists. And Sheen's culture work reveals why surface changes often fail. They do not address the deep assumptions that actually drive human behaviour. Unless change penetrates to the level of assumption, you get compliance without genuine adoption. Sheen's concept of humble inquiry provides the mechanism: stop telling, start asking. Genuine curiosity about how work currently gets done and what obstacles people face serves dual purpose. It surfaces information you need whilst building the trust that enables honest communication about implementation challenges. So here's what to do this week. First, map your most urgent change against scarf domains. Identify where it creates unnecessary threat and design specific mitigation. Second, acknowledge explicitly that people are experiencing endings. Ask them what they're losing and treat those losses with respect rather than dismissing them. Explain what's staying the same, not just what's changing. Third, normalise the neutral zone. Tell your team that confusion and uncertainty are normal parts of transition, not signs that something is wrong. Fourth, practice humble inquiry. Ask 3 people this week what troubles you about how this change is unfolding. And then listen without defending, explaining, or solving. Just listen. The question isn't whether you need to lead change. The question is whether you lead it in a way that triggers sustained threat response, ignores psychological transition phases, and leave deep assumptions unaddressed, or whether you work with how brains and humans actually function during change.